It is Y105, Dubuque's #1 hit music station. My name is Steve Pulaski. My next guest is the author of a book about the horrifying Brown's Chicken Massacre, which occurred back in January of 1993 in Palatine, Illinois. The book is called Something Big, and it tells the story of the brutal case that captivated Chicagoland after remaining unsolved for nearly a decade. He gives a new account of the story, taking readers behind the scenes and sharing the perspective of the people who lived it. He is Patrick Wohl. He joins us now. Patrick, how are you today, man?
Hey, Steve. I'm great. Good morning.
Great to talk to you, Patrick. Really excited to hear more about this book. I have to ask you first, though. I saw on your website that you are not only an author, you're also an attorney. So I want to give you the opportunity to talk a little bit about your background.
Sure. So this is my second book. My first book was about a political campaign in Illinois that got a bunch of attention in the 90s. Love the 90s and the nostalgia of that as a 90s kid, I suppose. But I'm an attorney and grew up in the Chicagoland area. Hearing about this story, for those who haven't heard of it, it's kind of a thing of lore in Illinois. People talk about it because it was in the news for so long, for almost 30 years. And so that's sort of what interested me in it. I was sort of shocked at how little had been written about it in the last 20 years, especially focusing on the people involved, from the police who, spent a decade of their lives on this to, of course, the victims who are kind of just sometimes a footnote in past retellings of it.
Yeah, the only other book that I can really think of on the subject of the Brown's Chicken Massacre is the Maurice Postley's book, which I've read. Did that help you in your research? I guess, how did you really get into motion writing about the Brown's Chicken Massacre?
It's an interesting question. I actually did not read his book until I had pretty much completed my research. And that was kind of on purpose because I didn't want to, subconsciously, have some of the same openings or write it in a similar way. And so really I started like anyone would, just going back to the basics, looking up, old newspaper articles and TV footage, of which there's a ton online from this case, and kind of going through it like people did at that time who were disconnected to it, reading the news. And then you dive a little deeper. You reach out to people who are connected to it in sort of a less intimate way. So people who were in the community, the mayor of the town, prosecutors or the defense attorneys, and then start working your way up to others and trying to talk to them. So, police who were involved in investigating this, past suspects, and of course some of the victims' families who talked to me about the lives of their loved ones.
So this is a comprehensive sort of account of the Brown's Chicken Massacre and such like that, too. Is that kind of what I'm getting at here?
Yeah, I would agree, and it takes people through the case, which happened in January of 1993. These 7 individuals were killed at a fast food restaurant when they were closing up. Their bodies were found in the fridge and the freezers, and then it went cold, essentially, or was unsolved for nearly a decade. And it ended up being solved, for those who don't know, in part by police being able to link DNA from chicken bones at this fried chicken restaurant to the killers. So it's sort of a very unique tie-in to this. And I take people through that aspect of it as well as the trials, and was fortunate to have access to a lot of things people didn't have access to in the past, such as the trial transcripts and just the kind of fortunate aspect of a lot of time having passed and people being more willing to talk.
He is Patrick Wohl, the author of the new book, Something Big, which chronicles the horrifying Brown's Chicken Massacre. What were some of the most powerful interviews that you obtained for Something Big? Some of the people that you talked to that just really left an impact on you and the story as a whole?
Well, there were a number of people, and you could really tell by speaking to them how much of an impact it had on them, too. So, for example, I spoke to the first suspect in this case. His name was Martin Blake. He was a guy a couple of years out of high school, a little quirky, and had worked at this restaurant before and was actually fired a few weeks before these murders. So police arrested him and investigated him, and really his name was run through the ringer. His face was on all the front pages of all the newspapers. They obtained home videos of him saying all sorts of crazy things, and that was, broadcast to hundreds of thousands of people. And he was forever branded as the first suspect in this horrible case, even though he had nothing to do with it. And he talked to me about what it was like to have such attention on him, and eventually he had to leave the state of Illinois because of that, which was a wild aspect of this. I also spoke to there were a couple false confessions in this case. So I spoke to one woman who confessed to the murders when she was being investigated, and I talked to her about what it was like to, and what possesses a person to confess to murder. I think there's kind of a assumption that people who would do something like that are dumb or uneducated, or there's some other reason they would do that, or they want the attention. And that was not at all the case of this woman. She was a perfectly intelligent, normal woman who later became a nurse and had a family, and she can kind of laugh at it now, but at the time it was just a wild experience. So I try to detail stories like that, as well as, of course, stories of the victims. And about the first third of the book is really dedicated to telling their stories in a much more in-depth way.
I did research on the Brown's Chicken Massacre for a school project many, many moons ago, too, and I remember looking at the photos of the victims, too, particularly the owners of the Brown's Chicken in Palatine, Richard and Lynn Ellenfelt, and just seeing how they looked, kind of reminded me of my own grandparents. And I think a lot of people looked at those faces of those victims and kind of saw the same, saw neighbors, saw friends, saw family members. And that was another reason this case hit home. Did you learn anything more about the owners, Richard and Lynn Ellenfelt?
Well, I spoke to quite a few family members of the Ellenfelds, and they talked to me really about the lives of their parents, and what it was like to make this decision to open up a franchise in this larger restaurant. They poured their life savings into it and really were dedicating their lives. So I talk a lot about their early stories and their decision to open the restaurant, the impact that it had on the family. And I think one really interesting anecdote that one of the sister of one of one of the victims shared with me was this case took a long time to be solved because you had to have the DNA, which I mentioned, and then also had to have someone come forward. And it was the ex-girlfriend of one of the killers who came forward. And that caused a lot of agony and for the families who had to wait. But it was interesting. One of the sisters of Dickie Ellenfeld told me, in the end, it worked out the way it was supposed to, because if the woman who came forward had come forward in 1993, it would have been her word, who was a woman with all sorts of issues, character issues, drug problems, had been fired from jobs, was in a facility when this happened, versus the word two men who really had no record. So there was an interesting, aspect, because I didn't feel any bitterness there, and I don't know that I would feel the same way. So it was really humbling to have those conversations.
What did you learn about the perpetrators of this crime, Juan Luna and Jason Degorski? What did you learn about them?
Well, I think the most shocking thing for people is that they lived very normal lives after this. They made this decision to kill 7 people, and then their motive was to do something big, which is the title of the book, of course. And when you get cases like this, in Chicagoland or wherever, where it's a mass murderer or a serial killer, typically they do things again, they kill again, or they commit other crimes. And that was not the case here. Jim Degorski, one of the killers, lived a pretty normal life. He had a little bit of a spotty record and had I would say, a violent past and a troubled past, but not something that was criminal. And Juan Luna was someone who came to this country from Mexico, lived a very normal life, got married, had a kid, was working, and by all accounts, a very normal person. So it was a very shocking thing for people to learn who committed these acts, because they were truly just people who were in they went to the same churches and grocery stores and high schools and were living among them the whole time.
The notes for your book say the Brown's Chicken Massacre is often misremembered. What discrepancies did you find in your research, whether it be like public opinion or anything along those lines?
I think the biggest misnomer is that the police botched this case. That's typically, if you go up to someone in Chicago who followed us over the years, that's often the first thing they'll tell you is that, the Palatine police, this kind of medium-sized suburb of Chicago, they weren't equipped to handle this case. And I think if in talking to the police and looking at this with the clarity of 30 years of hindsight, I don't think that's the case. I think they faced an intense amount of criticism that wasn't warranted at the time. There's no question that a suburban, police department may not have the resources to investigate something this big, but they didn't claim to do that. They immediately set up a task force. They brought in, some of Chicago's most experienced homicide detectives. They brought in people from other departments. They brought in the FBI. And ultimately, it wasn't their fault it wasn't going to be solved. It was only going to be solved in the way that it was, and that was someone coming forward. So I try to give the perspective of the police a little in a different way than it has in the past. There's no question there were mistakes along the way, and people will learn about that. And I think there's mistakes in every investigation. But the level of criticism that they faced, I think, was unwarranted at the time.
How has the city of Palatine grappled with this tragedy, decades later, from both a city and I guess a resident perspective, in your view?
Well, it's interesting. I interviewed the mayor of Palatine, and one of the stories she told me from the time, just that sort of encapsulates for people just how well known the story was and how much attention it got. Was she was at a conference a week or two after these killings in Washington, D.C., and she saw in a store at a gift shop, she saw James Earl Jones, one of the most famous actors on the planet at the time, the voice of Darth Vader. And she went up to him. She said, "Hi, Mr. Jones. My name is Rita Mullins, and I'm the mayor of Palatine, Illinois." And she handed him his card, and he paused and looked at her and said, "I'm so sorry." And so it was just an encapsulation of how just a mere mention of Palatine evoked these images in people's minds, even who had no connection to Illinois or the Chicagoland area. I think that's changed. I think, it's a perfectly nice, safe, beautiful community to raise a family in. And I don't think people necessarily connect it with these horrible events when you hear that, in part because the crime has been solved and just so much time has passed.
He's Patrick Wohl, the author of a new book called Something Big that recounts the Brown's Chicken Massacre that happened in January 1993 in Palatine. Patrick, I greatly appreciate your time. I want to give you the final word to talk anything more about the book. Where can people find it? Where can people find out more about you? The floor is yours. Sure.
Well, thanks again for having me. People can find the book on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Target, wherever you get books online. Of course, we'd love it if you ask for it from your local bookstore, too. And you can learn more at patrickwohl.com, or just go ahead and Google the book.
patrickwohl.com, WOHL, patrickwohl.com to find out more about the author behind Something Big. Patrick, I greatly appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.